By early 1944, the Allied campaign in Italy had reached a critical impasse. After months of fighting up the peninsula, progress toward Rome had slowed to a halt along a fortified German defensive system anchored on the mountains of central Italy. At its center stood Monte Cassino, a position that controlled the approaches through the Liri Valley and blocked the most direct route north. For Allied planners, the objective appeared clear: break the German line, open the road to Rome, and force a strategic withdrawal that would shorten the Italian campaign. Repeated assaults were launched with this logic in mind, each intended to achieve what the previous effort had failed to accomplish. In material terms, the Allies possessed superiority in manpower, artillery, and air power, and there was no expectation that the position could hold indefinitely. Yet Monte Cassino did hold, not once, but repeatedly. What was expected to be a difficult but finite operation became a prolonged series of battles fought under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Terrain, weather, and defensive preparation combined to deny the Allies the rapid breakthrough they sought. Each assault altered the battlefield, but none resolved it. The struggle for Monte Cassino was not defined by a single mistake or misjudgment. It was shaped by the interaction of geography, doctrine, coalition command, and German defensive strategy. Successive attacks were not evidence of obstinacy, but of the limited options available within a constrained operational environment. Understanding why Monte Cassino required repeated assaults requires examining why alternative approaches were restricted, why pressure could not be converted into maneuver, and why attrition became the dominant mechanism of progress. The battle illustrates how even overwhelming force can be absorbed by terrain and preparation, and why some positions cannot be taken quickly without first changing the conditions that protect them. The strategic importance of Monte Cassino derived from geography rather than symbolism. The town and its surrounding high ground sat astride the main routes through central Italy, controlling access to the Liri Valley and the road network leading north toward Rome. For the German defense, this position formed a natural anchor for a broader defensive system designed to trade space for time and delay Allied advance up the peninsula. By late 1943, German forces had organized a layered defense across central Italy that relied on terrain as much as fortifications. Mountains, rivers, and narrow valleys limited maneuver and funneled attacking forces into predictable approaches. Monte Cassino occupied a commanding position within this system, overlooking the primary avenues of advance and denying the Allies the ability to bypass the line without first neutralizing its strong points. From the Allied perspective, this created a strategic dilemma. The Italian campaign had been intended to draw German forces away from other theaters and open a secondary route into Europe. Prolonged stalemate undermined that purpose. Every month spent south of Rome tied down divisions, consumed resources, and delayed the broader timetable of Allied operations. Breaking the German line therefore became a strategic necessity rather than a purely tactical objective. Allied planning assumed that pressure applied at sufficient scale would eventually force a breakthrough. Superior artillery, air support, and manpower were expected to compensate for terrain and defensive preparation. The expectation was not of an easy victory, but of a finite sequence of operations that would wear down German resistance and open the route north. German strategy, however, did not depend on holding Monte Cassino indefinitely. The objective was delay, not permanence. By forcing the Allies to commit repeatedly against difficult ground, German command aimed to impose disproportionate cost and slow the campaign without risking large-scale encirclement or collapse. Withdrawal, if necessary, would occur only after the defensive value of the position had been fully exploited. This asymmetry of objectives shaped the early battles. Allied forces sought decision and movement. German forces sought time. As long as the terrain favored the defense and the Allies lacked viable alternatives, repeated assaults became not a failure of imagination, but a consequence of strategic constraint. The first attempts to break the Cassino position were therefore framed by urgency rather than confidence. Allied commanders understood the difficulty of the task, but saw no clear way around it. The Italian theater offered few opportunities for wide maneuver, and the pressure to maintain momentum outweighed the risks inherent in frontal assault. From the outset, Monte Cassino was less a single target than a problem of access. Until the defensive system it anchored could be disrupted, the campaign could not progress. This reality set the conditions for a battle that would be fought not once, but repeatedly, each time under slightly altered circumstances, but within the same fundamental constraints. The first Allied assaults against the Cassino position confronted the practical limits imposed by terrain and force alignment. The approaches to Monte Cassino were narrow, exposed, and dominated by high ground held by German defenders. Rivers, flooded lowlands, and steep slopes restricted movement and reduced the effectiveness of massed formations. What appeared on maps as multiple avenues of advance converged in reality into a small number of constrained corridors. These constraints shaped the opening operations. Allied forces attempted to apply pressure along several axes simultaneously, hoping to stretch the defense and identify a point of weakness. Infantry attacks were supported by artillery and limited armor where terrain permitted. But coordination proved difficult. Units advancing in parallel were often unable to support one another, and gains in one sector did not translate into operational advantage elsewhere. German defenders exploited this fragmentation. Elements of the Gustav Line were designed to function independently, allowing local commanders to hold key terrain even when adjacent positions were under pressure. Defensive fires were carefully sighted, and movement between positions was concealed by terrain and weather. The result was a defense that absorbed attacks without revealing a clear point of failure. Weather compounded these difficulties. Winter conditions limited visibility, slowed movement, and degraded logistics. Rain turned low ground into mud, further restricting armor and supply. Air support, a central component of Allied superiority, was intermittent and less decisive than anticipated. The environment favored the defender, not through fortification alone, but through cumulative friction imposed on every aspect of the attack. Early Allied gains were therefore costly and limited. Positions could be taken, but they could not be exploited. Each advance required consolidation under fire, and each pause allowed German forces to adjust. The tempo of operations slowed as commanders balanced pressure against sustainability. The expectation that momentum would build through successive attacks proved optimistic under these conditions. These initial battles clarified a critical reality. Monte Cassino was not a position that could be reduced quickly through application of force alone. The defensive system was resilient, not because of its scale, but because it was aligned with the terrain and supported by a strategy of delay. Without the ability to maneuver around it, the Allies were forced to confront it repeatedly on terms that favored the defense. By the end of the early assaults, it was evident that the problem was not insufficient effort, but structural constraint. The battle had entered a pattern in which progress could be made only incrementally, and each attempt to accelerate risked disproportionate loss without corresponding gain. This realization set the stage for further attacks that would seek decision under the same limiting conditions. As the campaign continued, Allied commanders were forced to confront the limits of their existing operational framework. The repeated assaults on Cassino were not the result of inflexibility, but of constrained choice. The geography of central Italy offered few viable alternatives, and amphibious options were limited by terrain, weather, and German coastal defenses. What emerged was a campaign in which pressure became the primary tool, not because it was preferred, but because it was available. Coalition command further complicated decision-making. The Allied forces in Italy were multinational, operating under a unified command, but with differing doctrines, capabilities, and priorities. Coordinating large-scale attacks required consensus and careful sequencing. Adjustments could be made, but they were rarely rapid, and changes in approach often lagged behind conditions on the ground. One of the most consequential decisions during this phase concerned the treatment of the high ground overlooking Cassino, including the Abbey of Monte Cassino. Allied commanders faced uncertainty regarding its role in the German defense. While direct evidence of military use was limited, its commanding position created persistent concern that it provided observation and control over the battlefield. This uncertainty influenced operational choices and reflected the broader challenge of acting under incomplete information. The decision to alter the battlefield through large-scale bombardment did not resolve the underlying problem. Destruction changed the terrain, but not necessarily in favor of the attacker. Rubble provided new defensive cover, reduced visibility, and further complicated movement. What had been an obstacle of elevation became an obstacle of debris, reinforcing the defensive character of the position rather than eliminating it. German forces adapted quickly to these changes. Defensive positions were re-established within the altered terrain, and the fundamental logic of delay remained intact. The defensive system did not depend on intact structures, but on control of ground, observation, and the ability to impose cost on advancing forces. In this respect, the transformation of the battlefield did not break the defense, but reshaped it without removing its core advantages. At the same time, Allied forces faced increasing strain. Repeated assaults consumed manpower, equipment, and time. Units rotated in and out of the line, but the cumulative effect of continuous engagement was difficult to offset. Each attack required preparation, coordination, and recovery, reinforcing the cyclical nature of the fighting rather than producing decisive change. This phase of the battle underscored a critical limitation of force application under constraint. When maneuver is denied and alternatives are restricted, even superior forces may be compelled to repeat actions that offer diminishing returns. The persistence of the Cassino defense was not a mystery of resilience, but a consequence of conditions that left the attackers with few options other than continued pressure. By the time the campaign entered its later stages, the battle for Cassino had become defined by attrition rather than maneuver. Each side understood that decisive movement was unlikely under existing conditions, and operations were increasingly shaped by endurance, replacement capacity, and the ability to sustain pressure over time. The struggle shifted from seeking breakthrough to managing exhaustion. For the Allies, this required a recalibration of expectations. The objective remained the same, but the means of achieving it had narrowed. Attacks were planned with greater attention to preparation and coordination, accepting that gains would be limited and costly. Artillery became the primary instrument for shaping the battlefield, compensating for restricted movement by imposing continuous pressure on known defensive positions. German forces continued to exploit the advantages of defense in depth. Units were rotated where possible, positions were adjusted incrementally, and resistance was calibrated to delay rather than to hold ground indefinitely. Withdrawal from exposed positions was executed selectively, preserving cohesion and minimizing loss. This approach allowed German forces to trade space for time without committing to decisive engagement. The interaction between these methods produced a grinding equilibrium. Allied attacks achieved local success, but each gain required consolidation under fire and could not be exploited beyond immediate objectives. German defenses absorbed these attacks, withdrew when necessary, and re-established resistance further back. The front moved, but slowly, and always at a cost that exceeded expectations. Logistics reinforced this dynamic. Supplying forces in mountainous terrain under winter conditions imposed strain on both sides, but the burden fell more heavily on the attacker. Movement of ammunition, food, and replacements was difficult and time-consuming. Any pause in supply disrupted operations, reinforcing the need for deliberate pacing rather than rapid action. Coalition considerations also played a role. Allied commanders had to balance pressure at Cassino with requirements elsewhere in the Italian theater. Resources could not be concentrated indefinitely without risk to other sectors. This limited the scale and frequency of assaults, further embedding the pattern of episodic, attritional fighting. By this stage, the battle's outcome was no longer in question, but its duration remained uncertain. Cassino would fall, eventually, but not quickly. The defense had succeeded in imposing delay far beyond initial estimates, and the cost of that delay was accumulating on both sides. This phase of the campaign illustrated the core reality of Monte Cassino. When terrain denies maneuver and alternatives are constrained, battles are decided by persistence rather than speed. Victory becomes a process of erosion, shaped less by single decisions than by the capacity to endure repeated effort under unfavorable conditions. The eventual shift in the Cassino campaign came not from a single tactical innovation, but from a broader reconfiguration of effort across the Italian front. By the spring of 1944, Allied command recognized that Cassino could not be resolved in isolation. The defensive system anchored there was part of a wider network, and breaking it required coordinated pressure beyond the immediate battlefield. This recognition led to the planning of a comprehensive offensive designed to alter the balance across multiple sectors simultaneously. Rather than focusing exclusively on frontal assault, Allied planners sought to stretch German defenses, limit their ability to shift reserves, and force choices that could not be managed through local delay alone. The objective was to change the structure of the fight, not merely its intensity. The resulting operation, later known as Operation Diadem, reflected this shift in thinking. Forces from several nations were committed along a broad front, with attacks timed to overwhelm German capacity to respond coherently. At Cassino itself, renewed assaults were integrated into a larger operational design, rather than treated as standalone efforts. This change reduced the effectiveness of German defensive elasticity. Units that had previously been able to withdraw, regroup, and re-establish resistance now faced pressure on multiple axes. The ability to trade space for time diminished as adjacent sectors came under simultaneous attack. Delay remained possible, but it no longer offered the same operational benefit. At the tactical level, Allied forces applied lessons learned from earlier battles. Coordination between infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery improved. Preparation was more deliberate, and objectives were defined with greater clarity. These changes did not eliminate cost, but they increased the likelihood that gains could be held and extended rather than absorbed and neutralized. German forces continued to resist with discipline and determination, but the cumulative effect of sustained, coordinated pressure began to erode their position. Supply difficulties intensified, reserves were stretched thin, and command flexibility narrowed. What had once been a controlled defense increasingly became a managed withdrawal under pressure. The capture of key positions around Cassino during this phase did not represent a sudden collapse, but it did mark a turning point. The defensive system that had imposed months of delay was no longer able to function as intended. Movement north became possible not because the terrain had changed, but because the conditions that allowed delay had finally been disrupted. This phase confirmed that Cassino could not be taken quickly because it could not be isolated. Only when the broader defensive framework was engaged simultaneously did progress become sustainable, transforming a series of repeated assaults into a coordinated advance that finally moved the campaign forward. The fall of the Cassino position did not immediately resolve the Italian campaign, but it removed the central obstacle that had shaped operations for months. Once the defensive system anchored on Monte Cassino was breached, the character of the fighting changed. Movement became possible where it had previously been denied, and the tempo of operations increased, though not without continued resistance and constraint. German forces conducted an organized withdrawal rather than a collapse. The objective shifted from delay at Cassino to establishing successive defensive positions further north. This transition reflected a consistent strategic logic. Having extracted maximum value from the terrain and the defensive system, German command sought to preserve forces for continued resistance rather than risk encirclement or annihilation. For the Allies, the breakthrough validated the shift from isolated assault to coordinated pressure. The success did not come from a single decisive blow, but from the accumulation of effects across the front. Cassino fell because the conditions that sustained its defense were removed, not because its defenders were suddenly overwhelmed in place. Operational momentum increased, but it remained bounded by the realities of the Italian theater. Terrain continued to favor the defense, logistics remained demanding, and weather still influenced movement and supply. The campaign did not transform into rapid maneuver warfare. Instead, it progressed through a series of advances and pauses, each shaped by geography and resistance. The lessons drawn from Cassino influenced Allied conduct for the remainder of the Italian campaign. Greater emphasis was placed on synchronization, realistic assessment of terrain, and acceptance of gradual progress. Expectations of rapid breakthrough were tempered by experience, and planning increasingly accounted for delay as a structural feature rather than an anomaly. At the same time, the cost of the Cassino battles shaped strategic evaluation of the Italian front as a whole. The campaign had achieved its purpose in tying down German forces and imposing attrition, but it had done so at a high price. Cassino became a reference point for understanding the limits of secondary theaters and the trade-offs inherent in their use. By the time operations moved beyond Cassino, the battle's significance extended beyond the ground taken. It had reshaped assumptions about how force could be applied in restrictive environments and reinforced the principle that victory in such conditions depends on altering the structure of the fight rather than intensifying it. Cassino fell not because it was finally attacked correctly in isolation, but because it was no longer allowed to function as the anchor of a wider defensive system, marking the end of a battle defined by repetition and the beginning of a campaign shaped by hard-earned adaptation. The Battle of Monte Cassino left a lasting imprint on how the Italian campaign was understood and conducted. Its significance did not lie solely in the ground taken or the road opened toward Rome, but in the clarification it provided about the nature of warfare in restrictive terrain under coalition command. Cassino demonstrated that even overwhelming force can be absorbed when geography, preparation, and defensive intent align effectively. For Allied planners, the battle reinforced the limits of expectation-driven operations. Early assumptions that pressure alone would force rapid decision proved inaccurate. Cassino showed that when maneuver is denied, superiority manifests slowly and at high cost. This realization influenced later planning by encouraging more cautious timelines and greater emphasis on shaping operations across wider fronts rather than seeking quick resolution at a single point. The battle also highlighted the challenges of coalition warfare under constraint. Multiple national forces, each with distinct doctrines and operational habits, were required to coordinate repeated assaults in a narrow battle space. While cooperation improved over time, Cassino exposed how friction within coalition command can compound the effects of terrain and defense, slowing adaptation, even when strategic objectives are shared. From the German perspective, Cassino validated the strategic utility of delay in secondary theaters. By holding key terrain and forcing repeated Allied commitment, German command achieved its objective of tying down forces and time that might otherwise have been employed elsewhere. The defense did not change the ultimate outcome of the war, but it influenced the distribution of effort and the tempo of Allied operations during a critical period. The battle further illustrated how attrition becomes the dominant mechanism of progress when alternatives are limited. Neither side achieved decision through maneuver. Instead, endurance, replacement capacity, and logistical resilience determined the pace of advance. Cassino became an example of how battles can be won through persistence rather than decisive action, even when persistence is costly and incremental. In institutional terms, Monte Cassino became a reference point for post-war analysis. It was studied not as a failure of courage or intent, but as a case in which structural constraints dictated outcome. The repeated assaults were not evidence of irrationality, but of limited choice within a narrow operational framework. Cassino therefore stands as a lesson in how wars are shaped by what cannot be done, as much as by what can. The battle was prolonged, not because victory was elusive, but because the conditions required for rapid victory could not be created without first altering the broader context of the campaign. The Battle of Monte Cassino concludes as a study in strategic constraint rather than tactical failure. The repeated assaults that define the campaign were not the product of obstinacy or misjudgment, but of an environment in which alternatives were severely limited. Terrain, weather, and defensive preparation combined to deny maneuver and force a method of warfare based on persistence rather than speed. Cassino demonstrated that overwhelming force does not guarantee rapid decision. When geography channels movement and favors the defense, superiority must be converted slowly through coordination and endurance. The Allies ultimately prevailed not by discovering a single decisive method, but by altering the structure of the fight through broader operational pressure. For German forces, the defense of Cassino achieved its intended purpose. Delay was imposed at a cost acceptable within their strategic framework, tying down Allied formations and buying time elsewhere. That success, however, was bounded. Once the conditions that sustained the defense were removed, continued resistance could no longer shape events beyond the immediate battlefield. The broader meaning of Cassino lies in its clarification of cause and effect. Repetition did not reflect error. It reflected constraint. Attrition was not chosen because it was preferred, but because it was the only viable mechanism available. Victory emerged when the constraints were addressed indirectly rather than confronted head-on. The battle also tempered expectations for the remainder of the Italian campaign. It reinforced the understanding that progress in restrictive terrain would be incremental and costly, and that secondary theaters impose limits that cannot be overcome through effort alone. Cassino became a reference point for planning that valued realism over optimism. In final assessment, Monte Cassino was not a failure of Allied power, nor a triumph of German strength. It was a demonstration of how modern warfare is shaped by environment and structure. The repeated assaults were the visible outcome of invisible constraints, and the eventual breakthrough marked not a sudden success, but the cumulative effect of adaptation applied across a wider front. Cassino stands as a reminder that in war, victory is often determined less by the brilliance of individual actions than by the ability to recognize limits, adjust methods, and persist until conditions finally change.